Well, hello everybody. My name is Jose Antonio Aguirre. I been trying to save the Mexican Cultural Institute of Los Angeles for the last 10 years. We were located in Olvera Street. This is an organization that has existed for 32 years, founded by the Mexican government, and then now run actually by people from the community like me. And here we are working together with Matt, trying to bring culture and to create bridges, cultural bridges between Mexico and here, Southern California and other places. And as a little note, I'm also do murals. I'm an artist, and I have several projects in public art, among them the East Los Angeles Library. So here is, and I have to be very thankful to Luis and Mark Zimmerman to be here, Luis Rodriguez, and Tia Chucha for opening the doors for this event. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Matt Cedillo. I'm the literary director of the Mexican Cultural Institute of Los Angeles, and I'm very, very honored to be presenting this event today. We're going to have a conversation between Luis Rodriguez and Mark Zimmerman. We're going to ask a few questions, just put them in conversation and see where it goes. Before we get started, though, I want to introduce Mark Zimmerman. He's a professor emeritus. He's won a number of, you were a recipient of a number of awards, nationally known awards all throughout the country. He's the author of so many books. One of the great scholars of Chicano poetry, Chicano culture, Chicano art. It's a really quite incredible body of work he's put together over the last few decades. Luis Rodriguez is the former poet laureate of Los Angeles, California, former gubernatorial candidate, the author of the seminal Always Running, again, a man who's won so many countless awards, traveled the entire world sharing his work. He's led workshops, his work in prison is world-renowned, and he's a world-renowned memoirist, and also just an incredible artist, incredible poet, one of the really seminal poets of Chicano letters. So it's a really great honor to be introducing this event and putting these two in conversation, both of whom are incredible friends to the Mexican Cultural Institute of Los Angeles. Luis has done a number of events with us at the consulate. He's also traveled with us to Mexico City in a number of events that we put on with our partners there in Mexico City, Chicano Frontera. So, Luis has been an enormous friend to us at the Institute, and to me personally, it's been something of a mentor. Mark, again, he's been an incredible friend as well to the Institute, has documented so much of the work of Mexican Americans in this country, and as well as a long time goes back with Jose Antonio back to days in Chicago, which brings us to our first question. I'm going to ask the both of you. Mark, you recently wrote this book, Mexican and Chicano Literature in Chicago, Transplanting Early Roots to the Barrios and Beyond. Luis, you actually, some may not know, since you're so heavily identified with Los Angeles, you actually got much of your real kind of first splash in poetry in Chicago. So what does the city of Chicago really mean to both of your legacies and careers? And we'll just open up that first Luis and then to Mark.
You want me? Okay. Well, I'm really glad to be able to speak about Chicago. I don't get a chance to do that very often. I love Chicago. I don't mind. I am an Amelinino. It's my home. But I want to introduce Tia Chucha Press and some of the books we did in Chicago, because it started there. And this is what eventually became Tia Chucha Centro Cultural. It started as a press. And just a few of them. I don't got Carlos Cumpian's book. I couldn't find it. It's a beautiful, I know. But just so you can see, you can't really see the beauty of the covers, but they're so beautiful. And I think what's important is that, if you can, there you go, you can see some of the things. Matt and David Romero started in Martillo Press, which I think is really the way to go. I started the Chucha Press because there really wasn't too many outlets for the poetry and the literature that we were working with, especially from the body, from the community, from the politically minded activists. And I thought that, well, I'm going to start it, and I did it. I did it with my first book, which, by the way, didn't bring me there. Some of them, by the way, now I have to mention this. Patricia Smith is world renowned now. She started with us. We also have Oh yeah, Elizabeth Alexander, who became the inaugural poet for Obama. I mention these because some of these have become famous. Michael Ward went back to San Francisco, and Matt knows him. He's one of the leading poets and organizers there in San Francisco. I don't want to get to all of them, but I do want to mention David Hernandez.
Absolutely.
We did her first book, amazing, powerful Boricua poet who really kicked butt in Chicago and passed, unfortunately, but he was like one of our mentor guides in Chicago for the poetry we were doing. So I just want to mention all that to say that this is my start in literature was Chicago. My first book was done there. I did it, Poems Across the Pavement. And Always Running was created when I was there. And pretty much my first books were all done there. So Chicago was the muse for me. It was the place where I felt I could express myself, be out there. And Mark knows I got very active there and was well known in the community for doing the work we did. I also went to prisons there. I worked in the homeless shelters. I worked for the Coalition Against Homelessness there, did workshops in the homeless shelters, and I ended up just meeting great people, and then of course opening doors for a lot of poets. So I want to just start with that. That's what Chicago means for me. It's my second home. I'm going there tomorrow to visit. They're going to do a 30th anniversary of Always Winning event there at Chicago History Museum on Friday. And
that's great.
Great to be back. I'm going to be staying at Paso Boricua, which was my home. I lived in Humboldt Park there, and I'm going back to my old roots. And people there, I guess they're excited. I got a lot of great response.
They are.
Okay, good. So I'm going to open it up to...
I had to leave town because you're coming in. No, but it's certainly true that I came to Chicago in 1980. And I guess I should say something about my background. People say, why were you? You were involved in this. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, a Jewish boy in New Jersey. Could have been a second-rate Philip Roth or something like that.
Or The Sopranos.
There's a lot of contact with The Sopranos I had, but my father had a restaurant and a lot of them came in. Ball players like Phil Rizzuto also came in, but a lot of Italians came in there, and I played football with the Italians, which saved me because I started dating some Italian girls and they were watching me very carefully at the time. Anyway, I married an Italian American and got to California and met her there, and she was a very dark Italian and everybody thought she was Chicano. So they started discriminating against us. And I said, well, if they're going to treat us like this, we might as well learn the language, at least try and start. So we started, and we didn't succeed ourselves. We broke up soon after. But she was sort of leaning me toward a Latin, certainly a Mexicano world. And I was there in San Diego for 8 years and gradually started learning the language, listened to the music on the radio, got off my jazz and started listening to Javier Solís and otros cantantes. And so my world began to change. And the Cesar Chavez movement came along and the Teatro Campesino, and I find myself getting involved with these things. I went back to the university, UCSD, and I met a woman there from Nicaragua, and then who was from Ensenada, but she was Nicaraguense. So I got involved with her. Her son became my son, and my world developed there. And then boom, I got my degree, and I ended up in Michigan and then in Minnesota. I said, I want to be near the border. What happened to me here? I'm in the snow again. I thought I had avoided it for the rest of my life. And in Minnesota, I was not a professor. I got a job as working with migrant farm workers. In fact, I can say that my Spanish improved considerably in Minnesota. So I went to the Nicaraguan Revolution, came back, and I ended up with a job, an improbable thing that I would be asked to be the coordinator of a Latino Student Center on a campus in Chicago at that time. But the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicanos could not agree on a candidate. So they hired this guy.
The compromise candidate?
I was the compromise candidate. I think well, we'll be a year or two and we'll get rid of him. But it didn't happen that way. So I was able to invite Luis and invite Carlos Cumpian, and some of the poets, include some that passed, David passed, Ken Cerritos passed. And because of my connection with Cumpian before Luis arrived, I got involved in a writer's project, taking notes and the questionnaires and sending them out to different people. A lot of people didn't respond. Some people did. Luis got one, and he did a really fantastic job. We published some of it a few years ago of what he said in the interview about Chicago and so on. In any event, the materials that became this book about the different writers from Chicago where I've been gathering the materials for 20, 30 years, and now I'm in my 80s, and I thought I better publish some of this stuff, or else it's going to be lost forever. And so it is. And there's a chapter on Luis in the book, and I read it this morning again. But that's a pretty good chapter.
I read it, yeah. It's pretty good.
Well, you can tell me the limitations of it. But one of the things I was trying to do in this book was to, first of all, say, hey, you know, there was a movement here in Chicago. That something happened here. It happened on the level of politics, culture, and literature, and art, especially in art. I met Jose Antonio as a young artist at the School of the Art Institute, and we were a Mexican artist visiting from Mexico City. And so gradually I got to know the artists, and I still have some work to do on that line, to write a book about that before I go, if I can. And
You should.
I'm going to try. But in any event, I just had a lot of different experiences with the writers, and you know, sort of was a good fellow traveler. When Sandra Cisneros was on the rise, I went around with her, Reggie Young, and some of the young writers at that time. We went from place to place, both in the Latino community out to the African American community, all over the city. We go to blues clubs, we go to jazz clubs. We had a great time. I was single again and on the move. And it was a great experience. And of course, Ana Castillo left, Sandra left, Luis Rodriguez came into town, and he really galvanized the scene. I mean, David Hernandez had been around for years. He was an outstanding performance poet, and nobody had put together a book of his work. And so we have a fine book of his work there, and now he's gone, but we have the book, and we really should think about reissuing the book. Yeah. Thinking about that, and because he was so important to the other Latino writers, especially the Cumpian and Cerritos and other people around him, because he was doing the kind of thing they wanted to do in a way, and they wanted to develop it in their own way, and they did that. And of course, with Luis there and Tia Chucha Press, his connection with Michael War, which was really instrumental. I wanted to do a book in which I talked about the development of this movement, and also gave space for the individual writers to talk about their individual work. I also wanted to show how they were, and I mainly focused on their Chicago-centered work, because I wanted to show how in the process of creating their poetry, mainly poetry, they were also creating a kind of mythos of Mexican Chicago, a world of Mexican Chicago. And Chicago does not think very Chicano. The artists think of Chicano, but the Mexicanos of Chicago think of themselves as Mexicanos. Yes. Even if they're Tejanos, many of them are Tejanos, but many all come from different places, and a lot of them come directly from Mexico. And the strong sense of being Mexican is there. But a group of young people who went to the Jorge Gonzalez's conference, I think 69, it was, came back saying, yo soy Chicano. And so they founded Casa Atzalan, they converted a settlement house into a place like that, and they started developing different kinds of things that constituted a virtual movement of writers. And I only talk about the ones who I considered who wrote more, who did more in this book. Yeah. But the other thing I wanted to do was to show that the Chicago influence led to a slightly different, it was clearly connected with the general Chicano writing, but it was also different because of the environment in which it grew, the industrial base that it had for many years, and that's some of the things you emphasize in my comment.
Which leads well into the next question. Recently, the Mexican Cultural Institute, we had last year, the honor of talking to Mike Amezcua, who just recently wrote a book called The Making of Mexican Chicago. Mm-hmm. And he wrote about the very specific ways in which, the backyards, the way that the specific economy of Chicago, Mexicans' role within the economy.
That was with the packing houses.
The packing houses really shaped.
And the steel mills.
The steel mills really shaped how their consciousness was different. It was shaped by the economic conditions that brought them to Chicago,
right,
as well as the response of people to them when they got there. So can you speak a little bit to the both of you to how the Mexicans in Chicago were shaped by the larger forces?
Well, I think they came to work in the steel mills and the stockyards because they had work. And Chicago, here's an interesting fact, and this is why I connect LA and Chicago a lot. They were the two most industrial communities. Right. And people didn't know that because LA is not known for that.
Exactly.
But this was highly industrial. And in fact, the Mexicans and blacks and others came here because of the industry. We had all those industries. We had steel mills. We had stockyards. We had aerospace that they didn't have. We had defense industries. We had shipyards, which really wasn't an industry in Chicago, but it was very big here. And after World War II, it got really big. I think what I loved about Chicago is because I always felt working class in East LA. And I went to Chicago and it was working class. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that I got really connected to. I thought this is right for me. This is a working class town. No matter what race, and you all had this working, everybody there in Chicago had a working class attitude. And East LA was like that, but not the rest of LA, maybe. Maybe not the West Side, maybe not Hollywood, but East LA was that way. And Northeast Valley was very working class.
San Fernando, Coima.
Yeah, all those they had the brass foundry, they had the GM plant in Van Nuys, which is very big. And in other words, I think the industry really was important because industry makes a different kind of person. You know, I don't know if you can see that, but even in Mexico, where the industry got really big, you become very much interested, I think, in community and other people that are like you. You begin to see, I think, the class differences, which sometimes people can't see unless they live through it. When you can see the class differences, it makes a big difference. You know, I got nothing in common with the boss. And even if he's a Mexican boss, I don't got nothing in common. You know what I'm saying? Most of them were not, they were mostly white.
Right.
But so it wasn't just race. It became, like for example, when I worked in the Bethlehem Steel Mill here, the whites controlled, obviously they owned Bethlehem Steel. They were all the bosses and all the skilled trades were whites. Mm-hmm. So all the black and brown people were in the laboring group, which was the lowest paid, hardest working group. When I went to Chicago, it was very similar. The poorest, hardest working were black and brown. The skilled trades were still held by whites and the owners were all white. So it tended to look racial, but it was really class. You know what I'm trying to get at? Yep. So I just want to point that out, that's what I felt a lot of this writing was. Right. Whether they spoke on it or not, these were working class writers for the most part. I do want to say that the important thing about me and Michael Ward is we started the Guild Complex, which was another important part of the movement he's talking about, that we created a space out of the Guild Books, which was the only independent, the most well-known bookstore in Chicago for politics, for literature, for poetry. It was the city lights, I guess, of Chicago, and people loved it. Richard Bragg, when he was running it, everybody knew him and loved him, and Sanderson, everybody came through there, and Michael had this idea of starting a nonprofit literary spot next door, and we read at the Red Lion Inn, which was a drinking old bar right there in Lincoln Park, about, I don't know, 8 to 12 of us, and we started the Guild Complex to help him. It was really his vision, and he became the first director. I was a board member, and we ended up doing a lot of the movement stuff that we're doing now, including the Etude Press became part of it. So we were pioneering, we were pioneering a lot of this work, and creating a press was important because there was a few small presses. The Haymarket was there, which is still very important. Yeah, there wasn't that many though, and we created a press for that, especially the slam poetry, but I'll be on slam too. It was just good poetry, and we also had all the voices that couldn't be published anywhere else. The black and brown and Asian voices, the couple queer writers that we published, even the white working class poets that we put, Tony Fitzpatrick, who was a great artist, a few others like that.
Well, I'd just like to add a few things to that. Of course, March Abrazo, which had started in the 70s, was the local first venue, you might say, of the local writers. There was also in Gary, Indiana, good working class town tied to the steel industry. That's where Nick Canelos and Davila founded Revista Chicano de Kenya, and then as they developed, founded Arte Público, what was, I guess, Arte Público Press, and had the success of having Sandra Cisneros' wonderful first book, or first novel, or I think it's a novel, published through them. And of course, eventually Random House got into a war with Canelos to get it away, and they did get it away, and she was launched as a kind of international kind of writer. Mm-hmm. But I have to say that one of the things I'm most proud about in my book is that I found, and it was through Arte Público, a book by a man by the name of Hugo Martinez Cerros, who was from Steel Mill, Chicago, and who reflects on the experience he had growing up in the 30s and early 40s. We had no other text of any writer dealing with that period. and the formation of Mexican identity in relation to the Germans, to the Irish, to very particular, it's not the whites, the different groups and how they affected, and the racism that he
Polish, Ukrainian, a lot of
yes.
migrants from Europe, yeah.
And of course, this is the far south side of Chicago, not close to the areas that, not that close in the city to the areas that were developed later. And we're very happy. I think my critique, and I worked on that with students, with my Latino students at the university, to develop those particular critiques and analyses of each story. And I think it may be longer than the book, the analysis. But we found so much rich material that really lays the foundation of what was the way Mexicanos were relating to this environment. The other factor about Mexicanos in Chicago is they came from the experience of the Mexican Revolution, both as people who felt marginalized by the revolution. Some of the people were cristeros, people who were involved in a kind of Catholic rebellion against the revolution. And there was always this double thing. There were people who were very pro-revolution in Chicago. There was always a struggle between those who were very politically progressive and those who really were rather conservative and did not want to rock the boat but find their way somehow in the world that was developing in Chicago. And it took a long time for there to be any literary expression from the Mexicanos. I've tried to find it. There may be more that I haven't found. That needs to be more work. But of course, it was very slow, and there were certainly more artists developing in the community than there were painters, and part of it had to do with linguistic insecurity. And it comes out the most probably in the writing of Ana Castillo, whose father was both a worker with a grill press and so on, and a gang member. So that double identity which emerges in Chicago. Maybe this was true of a lot of the Pachucos from East LA, who had parents who were maybe working class and maybe also members of gangs because of the nature of the situation in which they lived. And so this kind of duality that was in there, and of course the fact that they were so far from the border, so far from the earlier Spanish colonial impress, but it was there nevertheless. If I was in a classroom with Latina students, and I would say, I found out they were half Mexican, half Puerto Rican, Mexarican, we call them in Chicago. Mexaricans. Well, what are Mexaricans? And I'd say, Mande? Ah, your mother is Mexican. You know, because of that one little clue. And so it told you about the mixed identities, because the Mexicans in Chicago very early were among other Latinos, which created a shift in identity, and especially I think was important in the formation of women who could get away from traditional roles in the society. Mm-hmm. And the women who developed the writing, the most famous writers to come out of Chicago were Ana and Sandra. They were people who experienced a lot of repression on part of their own parents and wanted to find new identities and could find them because of the play of identities. Just think, because we were in an industrial society that was moving toward a post-industrial phase, which I guess culminated really, as you can see a lot of people getting laid off in the times you were in Chicago and having to find other kinds of jobs because the industries were leaving. The very industries were the foundation of their new identities in Chicago. So I'll leave it there with that, and we can go on to the next question.
Another question.
Yeah. Well, I actually wanted to follow up with something Luis had pointed out about the class-conscious nature of Chicago and finding similarities here in Los Angeles, but what the kind of peculiar difference is that, you know, LA is based on sprawl. It's town to town to town to town to town. Whereas like in Chicago, things are more condensed and more, you know, the rich and poor are on top of each other, and they travel along each other. I mean, LA is a town of freeways and just different parts. Whereas like Chicago is more. So how do you think that actually, just generally speaking, for working class people, how does that the fact that they are like in such much closer proximity to the rich, how does that differ from us here in LA?
Well, that's why I look at East LA, and I didn't grow up in the Northeast Valley, but a section like that as more Chicago than the other parts of LA. Because to me, East LA was like that. It was our people, it was working class, everybody was working class, everybody knew the taquilleras and the taquerias, but also, you know, the botanicas, everybody knew everybody, and there was a million people there, a lot of people there, all working class, all working in the industry, so when the industry left, they got impacted. And one good thing, different than LA was really Mexicano. It didn't become mixed Latino until the 80s when the Salvadorians and then Guatemalans and Honduras came here. Right. Now they're a very important part of our community. But at the time, it really Mexicano. In Chicago, the Puerto Rican-Mexican connection, I think, was very important because they met there. East Coast is mostly Puerto Rican, then later Dominicano, but for the most part, even though now in New York City, there's a lot of Mexicans.
Chicanos from Puebla.
Yeah, yeah. So, but at the time, Chicago was where the two most important Latino groups in the country met, and there was problems, interactions, but also a lot of love and. Because there's a lot of Mexicans when they run. So people tell me, hey, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans don't get along. Well, I don't know, man. There's a lot of Mexicans around there.
Somewhere.
Yeah, so
Love hate, you know.
I lived in the Puerto Rican neighborhood, Humboldt Park, Wicker Park, and Logan Square, and I loved it. I loved the Puerto Rican community, and they treated me very well. I didn't have any problems with anybody. There was, you get the tensions. The gang situation I want to point out was also different, but also had similarities. It was the industrial world created these gangs, and the two most industrial cities had the two largest gang communities. Larger than any other city, even more than New York, even though New York was also industrial for a long time. They didn't really take the gang structures the way LA and Chicago did. And they became the two largest gang communities because almost every gang across the country were either from Chicago area or LA. You know, so why is that true? Because the industry is where a lot of gangs come from. Street kids, lost, confused, not getting a job, not knowing being incorporated in work, and I think that added to it. The other thing of it is the deindustrialization contributed to economy leaving. Like a good example is the 10th Ward in Chicago, which had the U.S. Steel plant. When the plant died, I mean, I've been in that Mexican community. It was huge. It was beautiful. They had the Guadalupe Church. People hanged out there. There was also the black community. They call it the Bush. The black community was also part of that. They were all working steel mill. When the steel mill died, the community was devastated. The church was barely hanging on. People were thrown out. The Latin Kings, not the only one, but they became so big there. They were just street kids like here, you know, but they became very important. They became big for the drug industry. They became big for a lot of things. All of a sudden, the gangs became the most cohesive economic instrument in these communities. And so I saw that happening both in LA and Chicago, which is why the gangs became very big. They started off as street gangs. They weren't the outfit, they weren't mafias, but then eventually they got very well organized. And by the time that I got there, they were already at the high end of criminal enterprises. That actually, people don't know this because they always make a big deal about the mob, you know, and the outfit and everything. But the mob and outfit were actually being pushed out of the streets. They only had connections with the politicians and some vice things, but they were not able to do the street level. Was always now becoming Latin Kings, Gangster Disciples in Chicago was really run by black and brown kids, and they were getting very well organized. And there were many of them, and the outfit could never. I know when my son was in prison, he used to point out, and I don't want to knock these guys. They were hardcore guys. I mean, the outfit came out of Al Capone. These were lightweights. They were very high organized. They ran a lot of stuff, especially city-wise. But he was telling me that in the prisons, they were a joke because they had no power. They were always throwing their weight around. Nobody, because they didn't control the streets. And I mention all this because it shows that. Well, that's one thing that a Jewish lawyer told me. He was actually a lawyer working with me on my Mios case. And he was telling me, you don't know this, but this is what the immigrants, the white immigrants, decided. As black and brown people were integrating into the industry and everything, they didn't want black and browns any power.
Yeah.
So the Irish, for the most part, and some Eastern Europeans controlled the city hall. Remember Verdoliaks all the way to Harris and all these guys. And,
primarily the Irish.
Dailies and Dailies. And they were all gang members too.
Yep.
But they controlled City Hall. The Jewish Americans were controlling the courts. And I could see this because when I go to court with my son and other kids I was working with gang kids there. It was almost the courts and a lot of Jewish lawyers were Jewish. Well, almost all of it was really stark. And the Italians, the outfit was controlling whatever vice. And so they divided the city and the whole thing. This guy told me. That's why I like some of these Jewish Americans who are radical. They tell you the truth about things. He said, they decided to unite at that level to keep the black and brown out. And that's pretty much how you see now up to now where Chicago has been and where even LA has been, to keep the black and brown out. Those old immigrant white communities kind of came together just to make sure that wouldn't happen. That's why in Chicago you still have an immigrant identity. There's still, you know, the Czech communities, Polish, and there's still Italian American. There's the old Italian community that's been pushed out, but some of it's there. LA, they pretty much didn't do that. When they got to LA, when I was growing up, we didn't know if there was Italians, Jewish, or whatever. They were all white. They stopped being immigrants from other countries. They were all white. You know, we didn't care where they were from.
You had right next to East LA, or part of East LA, Boyle Heights, which was Jewish for a long time.
Yeah, but then what happened is the Jewish community, white flag, they left it. They went to Fairfax, they went to the West Side. But the only ones that didn't go, and I will tell you this to be true, were the radical Jews. They stayed with the Mexicans, and they helped politicize a lot of Mexicans. I know some of them. I don't know if you know George Mao. You know, some of them they became well-known activists. And what's his name? Cy Feinberg, who created the only bookstore in East LA, the Morning Books, that had radical books.
Really?
So I know that it was the Jewish radical socialists that stayed in Moyle Heights, that kept working with the Mexican Chicanos. There weren't too many of them, but they were there. But the rest of the Jewish community, when money were gone, they pretty much were. It's all Mexican were gone, even though they kept owning all the buildings.
Right.
They didn't get rid of the buildings. They just got rid of themselves. I mean, this is interesting.
It's a big side, you know, and as a Jewish American, I don't get into it too much.
Yeah.
I work, but I can say this, that a lot of the people who are involved in white flight preserve their kind of progressive views. In fact, this one very conservative Jewish guy, or Trump guy, says, "What's wrong with my people? They live like Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans." So that is the kind of contradiction you see. In Chicago, of course, the mayor, the alderman, the whole apparatus of the city, plus the Catholic Church, was very Irish-centered with some German support too. And of course, the church was people were leaving the church. Mexicanos left the church and joined other religious organizations because they felt discriminated against, violated in many ways. And so in the factories too, the pecking order was the foreman was Irish and everybody else was below, and below them were the Mexicanos and the blacks, and you know, who would play one against the other. And the playing of one ethnic group against the other was, of course, the bottom line there. It's interesting that the kings became now, Latin kings have a lot of Hmong membership among them too. People from, you know, who were discriminated against in Vietnam and who are, you know, a separate group in Vietnam. And finally, I just wanted to say that out of the kings, in relation to the kings, there were the young lords.
Yeah.
And the growth of the young lords, which was in Chicago before it went to New York, and I just went to a ceremony celebrating Chacha Jimenez, who was his last years now. Yeah.
Wait, did Cha-Cha pass?
No.
Okay.
No, but he's on
I
a
know.
breathing thing. He's not well. He's not well. And so the formation of the young lords is, I guess, what you represent in your poetry, is the way how we can take this experience of discrimination and marginalization and so on and make something.
But here's an interesting story about the young lords, and I knew Cha-Cha, so this is a very important part of it. The young lords became politicized. So was the Latin kings. They were also politicized. If you look at their Bible, they're very similar. The difference was the young lords was being attacked by the COINTELPRO. They were being infiltrated. When they got to New York, it became the Young Lords Party. They went after them. A section of the Latin kings, black and Puerto Rican, Mexican and Puerto Rican, met, and they made a decision. We're not going to be like the Young Lords because they're going to be coming after us. And they stayed very criminally invited. And mostly this was from the Mexicans, Southside kings, what they call the Southside kings. Puerto Ricans were much more political, even the young Latin kings they were. But they were all being, don't be like the young lords, because the young lords were basically political and attacked and pushed out. The Latin kings became bigger by not doing that and staying in the more criminal enterprise. By the way, it happened here in LA too, because in the 60s, a lot of the Chicano gangs became politicized, and I know I was one of them. And we were doing barrio writers workshops, and we were doing barrio peace circles, and we had the End the Barrio Warfare Coalition. It got infiltrated. Anybody that talked about barrio peace got infiltrated, and it affected the prison gangs here because they got politicized, and then after a while they made a decision, the same thing. We're not going to be political because as soon as we're political, they're going to come after us. If we stay in the criminal world, they did not go after them until the 90s. When they got so big criminally, then now they had to do RICO acts and all kinds of things. But up to then, they gave them free hand, as long as they weren't political. The Black Panthers, by the way, did the same thing. The Black Panthers were political. They went after them. A lot of people. Okay, I met a guy in East St. Louis. East St. Louis is part of Illinois. Stone ghetto. I was able to go and talk to kids. Miles Davis came out of there. There's an elementary school named for him, so I spoke to the kids. And I met with this guy who was used to be the Panthers, and he showed up in a meeting, all black community there, and I'm talking to them, and he's telling me this really important story because it relates to what I was talking about. When I was in the Black Panther, we said I was in a black gang. Nobody messed with me. I sold drugs. Nobody messed with me. I joined the Black Panthers. Everybody's tapping my phone. They're following me around. I can't do nothing. So I quit the Black Panthers, became a gangster again. Nobody messed with me. And that's very similar to what happened between the Latins for the most part versus the Youngers. And the same thing happened here with the Mexican gangs that were getting political. They got pushed out. I won't get into names and everything, but one of the key leaders in the prison system that was getting political brown berets and was also united with Daniel Cedeno and was also united with the Black Panthers, with George Jackson. He was killed. He was the head of the whole prison gang here. He got killed. And not too long before that, George Jackson was killed. They were both killed. And then everything was, you cannot be political. Stay. So these are the stories that I think are important because they tell you why things manifest the way they do.
In the part 3 of your book, you talk about the Chicano poets of Aztlan, and you have here named Carlos Cortez, Carlos Cubian, Raul Nino, and Luis J. Rodriguez. So without this becoming too awkward a conversation, Mark, how would you historicize Luis J. Rodriguez in league with these other gentlemen you named here?
Well, I think it's a great question. They were, of course, the first 3 names you mentioned were there before Luis came to the city. And they were scrambling. They were trying to develop, both individually and as a group, a movement and involving artists and writers primarily, a lot of theater people too, to do things, to carry out things, but they did not have the infrastructure, they could not create the infrastructure very well. I mean, the head of March was a good friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, Jose Gonzalez. He was the first one of the 2 founders of March, Movimiento Artístico Chicano de Chicago. And they struggled throughout the early 70s up to into the 80s to do these things. And of course they did some publishing. They had March Abrazo, which was the journal that had only 2 issues. Cumbian came in as the poetry editor of the second one. There was a split in the organization, and Cumbian and Carlos Cortez, who was the older fellow, the mentor of Carlos Cumbian, went one way, and Jose Gonzalez was kind of pushed out and tried to form Mi Raza Arts Consortium, brought all kinds of people to the city, did a lot of things to bring forth the Day of the Dead, de los Muertos, and many other aspects of Mexican culture and Chicano culture into the city. Poorly funded, none of them really knew much about how to get money to do things, and a lot of them didn't want to go through the standard procedures of doing so. Certainly Carlos Cortez, who had an anarchist background, his father had been a member of the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World. He had gone to prison during World War II as a conscientious objector, but he was half German and half Mexican. His Mexican father had been a union organizer in Milwaukee. So he came from Milwaukee, came to Chicago in the mid-60s, and he hooked up with, he never even thought of himself much as being a Chicano until he got to Chicago, when this was beginning to develop and become very serious business, especially in the early 70s. And so he was there. Kumpian was very young and fiery and ready to take on anybody and anything. And he was doing his thing and writing poetry and doing some public, he started doing some publications. March began to develop its publication series. It was rather, very beginning, and the question was, do they go beyond being Mexicanos and Chicanos? Do they really get into the Puerto Rican thing? They felt very close to David Hernandez, but they never published a book by David Hernandez, by the way. That's one of the things you could see, that they could not quite get it together. And that's why I sort of became sort of somebody connected with them, tried to help in my own, feeble way to help this thing generate. And then I have to say, Luis came in and I saw things taking off, and I saw them taking off through the guild complex. And I saw, my question to myself is he going to hook up with the other Mexicanos here and the other Latinos to do something for them? Because they were Cortez, no, because Cortez always had his outlet through the Charles Kerr and his graphic art. He was a great graphic artist, a cartoonist, and you can see we have this book that was just published by March. They're still going, and they're revitalized now a bit because of what's going on. They co-published the book with me, which was very helpful to me. When I couldn't get a university publisher for this book, and they would have taken care of it, they would have taken off. I had to revive my own La Casa books. But in any event, what I'm saying is that Luis played a fundamental role in vitalizing. He brought all he had already done in LA. Chismearte was the name of the revista, and he brought the spirit, an ecumenical spirit, connecting with other people, with African American community, with Native American community, which was very much part of March, by the way, initially. But I think you were able to bring that spirit forth, and in a way that it became a much more consolidated enterprise to bring this literature to the fore and mix it with other writers and other groups. And I think that's part of the spirit of my book, and I'll just say that in the end. What I'm saying is that I wanted to show, one, that the Chicano writers, the Mexican and Chicano writers of Chicago, as they developed, were very much on the level of the writing that was going on elsewhere, that they were moving in that direction, that in fact they brought new dimensions to the literature, especially the feminist dimension, I would say, and the indigenous dimension, which they revitalized in many ways in the midst of this urban working class situation. We were insistent on making their connection with Native American world. Certainly Kumpian and Cortez were very much involved in that. And that the other thing I wanted to do was, of course, to show how they created this image of Chicago, but I also wanted to show that they were not just working in their group. They reflected the writings, they made reference to the writings of other Chicanos, but they also were connected with world literature in different ways. And I tried to bring my background, tended me in that direction to a degree, but obviously, as you know, it's something that I would be able to find the connection between Ana Castillo and Sylvia Plath. Somebody else had worked on the question of Sandra Cisneros and Emily Dickinson, a 19th century Anglo woman from Massachusetts, that she had read her very well. She also was connected with Puerto Rican writer, Palos Matos. She was also connected with many other things. And even in Luis Rodriguez, I was able to find elements that reminded me of T.S. Eliot, even connections with other poets who had worked on the question of winter as part of the urban slush of life. And I think that his experience of the winters of Chicago gave a special dimension to his look at the urban world. And so I think that was part of my thing too, to try and show that these writers were not naive, narrow writers as some people had tried to portray them, but could relate to world literature as we know it, but still retained their Chicano identity, of course.
Yeah, I just want to add that when I came to Chicago, I had no idea that anybody would embrace me. I'm from East LA, but I embraced Chicago because, again, it was more like East LA to me. So it was like I'm going from working class Mexican community to a working class Chicago community, which was that happened to be Puerto Rican. What I found very interesting in the literary scene was people like Carlos and David Hernandez, and I got to know all of them, even Jose Gonzalez. I was friends with all of them. And I think what was good about, I don't know if this is good about me, but at least good what I did is I didn't get into any of the pleitos. I jumped in with everybody. I was friends with all of them.
Right.
I stayed good to everybody, I worked with all of them. I knew there was passers by. I was good. Carlos Cortez, he scored his house, be part of his Platicadas and everything. And of course, me and Carlos Cumpian, good old friends, we stayed friends, we're still friends. So it was very good for me because I was new. In that sense, maybe new to Chicago was good because now you can see the perspective. And then I was trying to unite as many people. We're not even trying, it was just more like connecting with everybody because in the African American community was a very important part of what I ended up connecting with. This is why some of our best writers at the Chucho Press turned out to be Patricia Smith and Elizabeth Alexander, and then eventually Terrence Hayes came to us with his first book, and now he's like the #1 premier poet of all time. So it's like we were constantly connected. I was also radically revolutionary minded. So this, I think, helped because a lot of them weren't necessarily. They were very
cultural nationalists.
They were cultural nationalists, and that was fine. I had no problem with that. But they weren't necessarily radical working class. Carlos Cortez was the closest to that, but I was, and so that helped me, I guess, navigate all of these things because I wasn't what you would call very close-minded socialist Marxist. There are a lot of them that are. I was very open-minded. I was able to work in all kinds of streams and still maintain that perspective of what's happening here and the class nature of things. So I think that helped me in many ways that I could talk and meet with everybody. I think that was probably the most helpful thing.
So this question is directed towards Luis. You named your press Chuchas after your aunt. So you have a beautiful bookstore here. You and Trini have built the work of Cagliarte. I want to walk in here, and there'll be no question of your connection to Mexican culture, to Chicano culture, to the indigeneity that's the root of both. But at the same time, when you formed Chuchas, one of the first things you did was publish David Hernandez. You published, you were so close with Michael Ward, you published Patricia Smith. So from the very gate, opening gate, you wanted, there is like a kind of, obviously, you're the publisher, so obviously there's this very Mexican part of it, but also open.
Yes.
And why, so what, can you tell us a little bit about that initial, that mindset that made you like right out the gates?
I would say that even though I work with the culture nationalists, if you want to call them, whatever you want to call it, work with everybody, I really wasn't one of those. You know what I'm saying? I was open to anybody that had a strong voice, powerful things to say, and powerful ways of saying it. And that was the way, that's why I included everybody. People would say, why don't you make this a Chicano press? It's just Mexico, because Mexico doesn't have a press. That would have been cool. It would have been fine. But I was so taken by all these other poets. And I was just talking to Dwight Okita, who was one of the earliest poets that we published. He's a gay Japanese American guy. And I remember when I met him, you know Dwight, did you meet him?
Yes.
Yeah, sweet guy, genius poet, genius. And he never could get anything published. And I saw his work and I go, dude, we'll publish you. He was amazing. Anybody's interested in my work? That's what interested me, what the work was, not whether you were Japanese or black or Puerto Rican. You know, I obviously loved David Hernandez because he stood out. He was powerful. Nobody had published his book. Let's do it. So the idea being that I was open to any good work. It didn't mean I was going to publish everything and anything. I was having my perspective about being real to the world, speaking to the world, but also personal and political. You know what I'm saying? Where you can traverse both those things. And so I think that's what helped me. Again, if you're closed-minded about anything, you're not going to get too far. I try not to be closed-minded, even though I was very strictly thinking about things. I wasn't closed-minded. I worked with all kinds of people. That helped.
So, before we add this event, we would talk about the idea of doing something online. And maybe I would really love to extend this conversation between the two of you. Welcome you both to talk on a Zoom with the Mexican Cultural Institute. We can extend it for like a 2-hour conversation. Really talk more about this. Maybe we can bring Carlos on as well.
I think that would be great.
And maybe we can invite some, Steve, we can invite a lot of people that are in this book. But we are coming towards the end of time, so we'll ask our final question at this point in time. Mark, you have made reference throughout this entire conversation to Ana Castillo, as well as Santa Cisneros. They are prominent parts of the book.
Yes.
Luis is a chapter on, but you discussing all their works in relationship to Emily Dickinson, to T.S. Eliot, to figures that are very large within world literature.
Right.
And I would ask you, this is my final question, would be, how would you contextualize Santa Cisneros, Ana Castillo, and Luis Rodriguez as figures not simply in Chicano literature, but as figures in world literature?
Wow. That's a great question.
Really?
Well, I think both. I'll stick with the two people who grew up in Chicago first. These two women were in the working class. Anna very decisively working class in background, connected to the gang world of the area of Chicago called Taylor Street, which was half Italian and increasingly Mexican. That formation on Taylor Street was, and both of them were around Taylor Street really, because the older community, one south is the South Side, but then the community that developed is called the Near West Side, or the Jane Addams Hull House area extending up to Taylor. And in the 1950s, as these two women were growing up, the decision was made to create the University of Illinois at Chicago, and simultaneously almost, the expressway, which was known as the Dan Ryan, which went through the old Mexican community. You know this story, this happened in San Diego, it happened here, of this tremendous displacement of older communities. And so the Mexican community that was in that area went through a series of tensions. There was the tension between the Italians and the Mexicanos, without a doubt, but also certain things happened. As we know, the Mexicans emerged. So the Mexicans tended to move further south, along the corridor of Halsted Street and up to, say, Western, which had been a Czech area, and became Bohemian area, and it became the center of Mexican culture in the city. Some of them went further up toward La Villita, which we call Little Village. La Villita emerged as the most commercial and most extensive and most gang-ridden area of the Mexican community per se. And there were Puerto Ricans embedded in that area. So their contact with these other people were very much part of their process. These two women emerged from this. One was in private school, went to Loyola, and from Loyola she went to the Iowa Writers' School, and she was on an upward mobility path you would never believe. And of course, she had a rich literary culture, which included, I never even thought of him as Puerto Rican, William Carlos Williams, who was half from the Afro-Caribbean area and also from Puerto Rico. And he became a major poet, and he influenced her work. And both writers have references to William Carlos Williams. And she imbibed some French philosophy about space, which then became part of her thing about the nature of the space, Mango Street and the spaces around it. And so she developed in her way, came and realized that she had a voice that was different from the white kids and others who were in the Iowa Writers' School, came back to Chicago, met up with the March people and had, an interaction. She didn't fully approve of the way they wrote, but she learned a lot of things, which she always acknowledges how she learned from the two Carloses and the other people there. And so she was on this platform. Ana Castillo went to a secretarial school. And she became, at one point, the receptionist to a writer friend of mine who was also a doctor. She has a very famous poem about being a receptionist, which I will not quote here. But she tried to go to the School of the Art Institute because she had an art interest very strong. And she felt completely alienated there. She went to one of the more working class universities in the city. And she was on a path that she was going to be a secretary for a while. She was going to be a secretary. And then she had this awakening. She awoke to the Chicano movement that was sweeping the country. She writes about this beautifully. And she emerges as this woman who is interested in tropical dancing and hanging out here and there, but also writing poetry about it. And also, increasingly, she realizes that the Mexicanos who were writing around her were still tied up with Aztlan, and they were still kind of machista. She wanted to get away from that. So she became one of the first really strongly feminist writers. Sandra's emergence was slower and more refined, perhaps, in certain ways. Ana always described her writing as writing with a club foot because her Spanish was stronger there, and she also felt insecure with the language and being a writer. And she wrote book after book after book. She's written in every genre you can possibly imagine. Sandra's been more careful in her work. Beautiful, Mango Street. Ana's closest book to that world of Mango Street is My Father Was a Toltec, dealing with her father as a gang member and a member of the working class. Strong poetry about her relationship to the Italians in her neighborhood. Strong, very, very fine poetry about living in the hood, let's say. And that was her kind of growing up story. The growing up story, of course, connected them to world literature, because every culture has growing up stories, and everybody, whether it's James Joyce or whoever, has a story of rough times being where they were in their particular place. And so they both did that. But Ana very early reached out and wrote a book that was very sophisticated. It was a trip to Mexico, sort of like you might find in Saul Bellow, going to Mexico, doing this and that. And she created, and she used an old form in a way, it was letters, but it was also Cortázar. She was drawing upon Latin American influences, and she cites Cortázar. You could reorganize this book in different ways and so on. And of course, Sandra's great strength was her lyrical quality, tremendous poetic lyrical quality that she has, and it shines every time she gives a reading, every time she writes a poem, and it shines in her follow-up book, Carmela, which she finally got together. I think she has trouble with the novel form because she's basically a poet, and wants to keep that poetry poetic drive so alive that it may hurt her writing narrative in a way, I don't know, but it's been a conflict, I think, for her to write the larger forms. And of course, they both have had incredible careers, and they both have had won prize after prize, and have really carried the ball of feminist issues and so on as part of the process of modern Chicano literature. So they played a very important role. And even other people came out. Carlos Morton, he grew up in Chicago, wrote sometime and came out into the world as a playwright and so on. But these two women, of course, you cannot write a book on the rise of Mexican and Chicano writing in Chicago without spending a lot of time with them. Mm-hmm. Luis Rodriguez really created almost a whole school of urban poetry in Chicago. I mean, the poems that are in the Pavement book, and then the other books. What's the last one you did in Chicago? I could never pronounce it. Troche Moche. Well, this was already. I thought it had some sense of Alarista and other of the Chicano poets that got in there in the sense of language and so on. But he brought L.A. and Chicago together, just as he did in his discourse today. He brought them together to create a new kind of Chicano vision, which was más allá, more beyond the question of nationalism, really getting to the roots of the struggle of Mexicans and of all peoples, I guess, in the course of their development in this country, which has its ups and downs and its in and outs and its great part of suffering as well as happiness, and which people struggling to find their way. And that's in his poetry, and it makes it, of course, a poetry which everybody here and around the country has learned to really appreciate.
Luis, last question. Recently, a few years ago, there was a Netflix documentary on Carlos Almaraz, and throughout the entire thing, they're talking about Carlos as a painter that should stand across the world, not just a Chicano, not just a. And it's very struggles. It's fascinating thing because so much of the work of Chicano artists, not just Carlos, but many people, so deeply influenced by the Mexican artists, and people readily embrace the fact that Mexican artists are some of the greatest artists of all time. Mexican visual artists, and I think there's a similar thing with letters. People can embrace in this country can embrace genius from Mexico and from South Florida. Oh yes, the genius over there. But in many ways, the Chicano struggle is to actually get us to be viewed as people who are performing on the world stage. So could you briefly, why is Chicano art as good as any art being produced anywhere in the world, including
Well, I was surprised when I first, I was with the Sandinistas too, and I was able to go to Central America, and I was surprised how well they knew what Chicanos were. There was a Chicano brigade with the Sandinistas, and I actually met a guy that got shot there and became a good friend of mine. He was fighting with the Sandinistas. Because there were some Nicaraguans that were living with Mexicans in LA, but also San Francisco, the Mission District. So they were, when I went to Nicaragua, they were like, Chicano, oh my brother, they were so good to me. And I got to meet others. But what really amazed me to me was Mexico they didn't really want to touch Chicanos at the time, for the most part. The gente always, the pueblitos always, but not the academic. But Europe, I was surprised that Europe knew who we were. I was surprised how interested they were. I went to Paris in 1991. They invited the University of Paris, brought me there. I don't know if you ever know Georgina Fabre and some.
I met her, yes.
Yeah, they were all into Chicanos and African Americans and all this stuff. They were really, they knew our work and they understood it and they saw me. I came in there and they put me in a place I had no idea. You know, I read the Shakespeare Company and in the Village Voice, which was the English-speaking bookstore, but they had people packed. And then I ended up in Germany, and Germany was the same thing. You ever know Wolfgang?
Wolfgang
Yeah, he was really good. And then my friend Horst Tahn, and also at Stuttgart, Southern Germany, had a lot of interest, and they studied. My books were there, and all the. I was really amazed that the rest of the world knew who we were, but the U.S. we were battling just to get seen, be heard, compared. I went to Tokyo, and Tokyo loved Chicano culture. It's like, oh my God, roll riders, cholos, and they knew who I was. And,
amazing.
but you can't see that kind of interest among other U.S. academics. You might see it among Chicanos, Puerto Rican flags, but you don't see it. So I think that's what Woody was telling me, that the world was open to who we were, knew who we were. And then eventually, as all you guys know, Mexico opened up.
Yeah.
Because of all the Chicanos that ended up getting deported, and they pretty much, for the last 30 years, millions of them, it wasn't just a few, they have impacted the culture there. Now there's the academics, UNAM, through both these brothers, helped us get into UNAM and met Chicanos Sin Fronteras, Chicanx Sin Fronteras, and then I was in Guadalajara with a big giant lowrider show. This was almost unheard of a few years ago. You wouldn't see this. It was a big deal. The mayor gave it his blessing, whatever. In other words, even Mexico is changing. So I'm still thinking we're not quite as well known here in this country compared. I still think it's a struggle. I'm still trying to get, I'm fortunate that I've been published by small presses, medium-sized presses, and the big boys. Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins published 4 of my books. I'm still having a hard time getting back to them. They're really not sure about us. Even though if you look at our books here at the Achuchas, with any Chicano book, we probably got it. There's more of them happening. It's really good. But I still think the country doesn't quite get it like other places. That's my feeling.
Could I just add something to that? I was just in San Francisco and I went to the MoMA, and there was a big lowrider exhibition going on. And the next day I was in Sacramento and I went to the Crocker, and there was a thing of the Royal Chicano Air Force. And I went over to the Davis campus, and there was an exhibition of Malquias Montoya. And I think that indicates some mainstreaming going on there. The same thing was happening in Chicago with the Puerto Rican artists at the MCA, Museum of Contemporary Art. So it's not just at the Mexican Museum. If they was there, they had a show at the Art Institute of Remedios Barro, who's not Mexican, but who's part of the world of Mexico.
Gamaliel got a big show on something in Ramirez, remember? In Puerto Rico, he did a big show.
Yeah. Well, he died some years ago, and of course, Oscar Martinez had a big show, who's the other original Puerto Rican artists of that time, had a big show at the Puerto Rican Museum, and some of it has been mainstream now.
That's probably true. Yeah, it's little by little.
Little by little. You know, that's a beginning. They hire people now to be curators. They hire a Mexicano to be a curator so that they do get some more, or a Puerto Rican woman to help out and this and that. So they're trying to be more diverse. Of course, there are pressures against that too right now. So,
yeah, I will have to say that the Achuchas, for example, we kept going when nobody wanted us, nobody gave us funding. We just kept going and going. And now the funders are giving us big support, and it's just starting to happen where they're looking at us. And not only that, we have funders that are taking our model to other communities of the idea of a nonprofit bookstore and culture space, our model for other communities to emulate. And our directors and some of our staff have gone to other cities to talk about how this works, because now they're looking at this as a hybrid model of a bookstore with arts and everything. So there's some interest in some of them.
On that note,
I don't know if there's any questions from the audience we might want to.
A quick one.
Yeah.
Did you all have any interaction with Salcedo Press at all?
Yeah.
You probably, I don't think I.
Yeah, well, I used to go to, they used to have a party every year, the Primero de Mayo, el Cinco de Mayo. So it was, and they had a Mexican band, and they had people from the Wobblies and other left organizations throughout the city. And they were very, they were a very multicultural group of people, including Victor Cortez and other people who were Mexican in origin. It was hard to work with them in some way. They were absolutely firm union people, and nobody had any money. It was hard to, and they'd say, we'd love to publish your stuff, but we need to have a certain budget, and it was hard to get the budget. So some places developed in the barrio, and we would tend to, use their service at Salcedo and so on. But they were a very progressive group. A lot of them were involved in Cuba work, and they were members of Venceremos Brigade, and I think they would go to Cuba in those days when people were really trying to support the revolution. And I don't know what's happened to them now. I was asking just the other day about where are some of the people who I knew. I ran into one at the jazz thing a few weeks ago at the Jazz Festival, and I asked, what's happened to the people from South State? The press doesn't seem to exist, and where are the people? And I know that some of them are around, and Victor just published a new novel, or a collection of stories, I think it was. I haven't read it yet. And a lot of people writing, by the way, in Spanish. A lot of Mexicanos writing in Spanish in Chicago, and Latin Americans from all over Latin America are writing, and artists from all over the world have come now. But it's primarily still a Mexican group in Pilsen trying to hold on against gentrification. But it's hard to go further with that question because I don't know what's happened to the people.
I could find my daughter used to work there, so I can probably ask. Okay.
Yeah, it's good to find out. I've been thinking about it a lot because they have a lot of poster art of different events, Cinco de Mayo and other things that would make a wonderful addition to any knowledge about Mexican art in the city. Maybe Puerto Rican too, but certainly Mexican.
Cool.
Including Romero, did a lot of work through Salcedo Press. One of Jose Antonio's friends, fine artist in Chicago.
He probably still works with them.
Pardon me?
He's probably still working with them.
Do you think they still exist?
Well, I'm not sure. I have to ask Alejandro because Alejandro's been doing the Fiesta del Sol poster for 40 years now.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, I just have a comment. When you were mentioning about the Mexicano situation with the Chicano, I think that's part of the Criollo mentality, really. And we still see it right now. I mean, it's very interesting for me to observe, in the last 6 years or so, what's going on. And you still have this group of the middle upper class, or the chosen ones, who are still against, especially, the more indigenous people. And it's mostly, I think it's a very question of class, not more than anything else, because if you have the money, it doesn't matter if you're brown, if you have the money to show up, and if you as brown say, yes, I have the money, but I'm becoming white,
No, I think you're right. I think there is in Mexico, the class thing is very real. The other thing was that speaking about the indigenous, I got very active around the indigenous community in Chicago, and we started probably one of the first movies, may not have been the first, but one of them, and we were with the first dancer group, which is still there. Our friends still there. We were the first ones doing it. Nobody at the time that I was there knew what Mexico was. You go there now, there's dancer groups all over Chicago. They're constantly having events. They're constantly everywhere. It's really grown, and so I always felt that was another part of my contribution was connecting us to the Mexica indigenous. But what I also did, which was important, Native American. Pine Ridge, Lakota. I went to all the Native American conferences in Wisconsin and everybody. I was one of the few Chicanos showing up. And of course, I would show up with this guy from Oaxaca who was Zapoteco, and they loved you. You guys, what tribe are you? And of course, I say, I'm Chicano. What? And then they didn't know who you were. And then when they said, my name is Luis Rodriguez, oh, you're Hispanic, they were, in the beginning, they went, no, you're Indian. I look more Indian than most of them. But it took a while to win them over. It took a while because they were like Mexicans. But now there's so many Mexica danzantes. Now the powwows around the country, but especially here, include Native American tribal groupings, but also Mexicas from Mexico. So it's starting to change this part of it.
And I think also it's part of the language, because at that time, we're talking 40 years ago, not many Chicanos will speak Spanish.
That's right.
And the opposite in Mexico, I think that this crossover of the migration has brought has closed that gap a lot. And a lot of the Mexicans who were educated in Mexico at that time. Obviously, they were aiming to be where at the Chicago University, or you know, it was not a strong interest, but it's close. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
But still, the struggle is still there.
Yeah, still there, but things are starting to come together. And I want to say something about that. One last thing. I was in conferences. I speak pretty good Spanish. You know, but people will always complain about Chicanos speaking Spanish, especially some of the right-wing Cuban writers. Not all Cubans are right-wing, but the ones that I knew, they were right-wing. Oh, you Chicanos can. I told them, you never had to go through what we went through. You never had to get slapped across the face for speaking Spanish, or you don't know what it was like. They forbid it, they punished you. You don't know how hard it was to hang on to your Spanish. And the fact that I hanged on was a miracle, because they did everything they could to knock it out of me. So it's important people know that's a different history. The Cubans, when they came from Cuba, the right-wing Cubans, Cuba into Miami, they had my language education. They gave me all kinds of support. They didn't do that with the Puerto Ricans or the Mexicans in these communities. They had to fight to keep their Spanish, and many did because it was a struggle. But it was hard. It was hard when you're getting punished, and people need to know that part of it.
Well,
I have a question on that, because online there's a lot of discussion on like Chicanos that don't know Spanish, and when they see, oh, you're Mexican, but like Mexican American, you're Mexican, you don't know Spanish, they kind of already like alienate you from being Mexican, and if you try to participate, it's like kind of a pushback. I'm one of those children that my parents are Spanish speakers, but like I was nonverbal, and my mother had to choose between Spanish and English for public school.
Right.
So she chose English, and she drilled it into me so that way I could participate in like public school. And then growing up now and seeing those, like, mostly I see it online. In person, I'm generally like welcome if I don't speak Spanish, but it's mostly like, oh, like you're an Osavo kid, or like you're not. And I don't really take offense to that, because Spanish, where it came from, isn't really like indigenous, so I don't take offense to that.
Right. They're both colonial languages.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, and that I try to go, instead of like, okay, go Spanish, I do need to know that, but I'm like, oh, I'd rather like learn Nahuatl and get into that, even though it's, because I do think it's trying to come back, I think, right? But what are your like, I guess, words of encouragement for like people who, you know, with the not speaking Spanish and still wanting to hold on to like the Mexicanness?
Well, I would say
identity.
Learning languages is not so hard as people make it out to be, because in Europe they speak 2 or 3 languages. Other parts of the world speak 2 or 3 languages. And so I think people should hang on to the Spanish. I know it's a colonial language, and if they don't know it, learn it. And the way you learn it is being about Mexicans, learning and speaking to them. You know, my family always spoke Spanish, so that's why I kept whatever Spanish I have. Is my familia, my mamá hasta que se murió, never spoke English. She's been here 55 years and never spoke English. You know, so that's how you learn. I think keep your Spanish, learn English very well, dominate English. It's very important. And learn it in indigenous language if you can. Nahuatl is the language a lot of people are learning, that we actually teach it here. We have capulis, and they teach it in their own learning, and people are going to Mexico, learning their schools down there. So learn as many languages as you can. I think that's the best thing. I find languages should be traversed. But if you want to dominate a language, I would say dominate the language that you can best speak to the world. I think for me it's English. I want to dominate English because I wanted to speak to the English-speaking world and yell and scream at them. You know what I mean?
Right on.
On that note, I want to thank both of you for, on behalf of the Mexican Culture in Los Angeles.
All right, thank you all.
Right
It was
on.
great. Great to see you. Great to meet you. And we didn't meet the people behind, but welcome, and hope you enjoyed what you heard of this session. It's been a great pleasure for me to be here, to see the world that Luis helped create.
Yeah, you have to see it,
and,
man.
and
I love
it's
this
a
store,
beautiful
man.
place. I was
Yes.
at the old one too, some years ago.
Yeah.
But this is a gorgeous place, and may it thrive in the time to come. Thank you very much for joining us today on pretty short notice, but it